the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. This video is about their potential future actions since the 2023 summit meeting in Vilnius. This is Urban Sentinel. Let's get into it. Now, NATO, as you know, they meet every year. They discuss whatever present issues are going on and plan out future events. Currently, the main thing on their docket is Russia's action in Ukraine. The focus of this NATO summit, above any of the previous ones, is going back to old school, going back to when NATO was first formed to counter the Soviet Union, now dissolved and is now the Russian Federation. The intent is still the same. That being said, the NATO Readiness Action Plan is a detailed deterrence and defense measure to respond to Russian aggression. Now, the key thing is, in the simplest terms, NATO and all of its members agree that any act of aggression, perceived or actual, and those are very important, will be considered an act of aggression against them all. Sort of the three musketeers, all for one, one for all. So what that means effectively is that any type of nuclear incident, as you've seen in most of the news, is the primary thing that's been stressed. If any type of nuclear incident occurs, either direct, military or paramilitary, or perceived, whether it be accidental against another NATO country by Russia, and again, the nuance in that is very, very subtle, but also kind of obvious. NATO reserves the right to effectively clap back in whatever measured response they determine necessary. So as an example, if by chance the Russians were transporting a nuclear device and it was still on their side of the border, they're transporting it by train, and according to a potential Russian spokesperson, it was struck by a drone detonating the device very near the border. Now, you can look at it as a case of the Russians may have tried to move a nuke across the border into Ukraine, or you could have looked at it as a case of the Russians had no plan to actually move it into Ukraine, but blamed the attack upon the drone operating nation, which most likely would have been Ukraine or any other ally assisting them. Because with those small gray areas, the perceived or actual threat is a loophole that NATO could use to then bring the full weight of NATO down upon Russia. Overall, second thing to look at, the enhanced forward presence. NATO deploys a multinational force, battle groups stationed throughout Eastern and Central and Western Europe. NATO has, I believe, 30 member nations and approximately 20 plus non-member but supporting nations. Some cases it's simply nations that will allow NATO allies to fly over through their airspace to, shortest route through. Other cases it may be countries that aren't directly involved with NATO, but they provide some level of support. It might be logistics, it might be supplies, it might be simply transport, whatever the case may be. So they may be unofficial members, but they sort of side with and help out where they can. All of those different units all across the countries, NATO has staged up. And what that would enable them to do is, in a specific case of NATO versus Russia, they have multiple bases to launch airstrikes against. They have multiple locations to put air defense, early warning. If it does come to a case of nukes, many of the NATO countries already have their own nuclear arsenal. So effectively speaking, Russia, from their perspective, strictly talking about ICBMs and nuclear missiles going up in the air back and forth, Russia would have to be able to target multiple countries and their locations for their ICBMs versus what we would expect traditional United States versus Russia, our bases and their bases, and everyone pretty much still has the same game plan with the random wild card of where a submarine might be or a nuclear capable bomber might be. With NATO as a whole working together, it's a larger force than what Russia currently has. Right now, it's Russia versus Ukraine, and Ukraine is getting back end supplied by all the other various NATO members. If it does come down to a full one-on-one or 1-on-30, NATO as a collective force can then bring in manpower, additional aircraft, naval power, satellites, full on everything, and it's simply a case of how long before Russia taps out. Third thing to think about, NATO has a cyber defense network, again, comprised of multiple nations monitoring and safeguarding the member nations' infrastructure, because cyber attacks can occur. They can completely disable and disrupt not just the civilian aspect of a nation, but the military and government aspect of a nation. Depending upon the type of virus that may be put in or program that may be co-opted, it may be impossible for NATO bases to determine true or false radar signatures. Satellites could be taken out of orbit or misaligned. Information could be intercepted or outright blocked in transmission from one critical base to another critical base if a cyber attack occurs. So they work diligently to improve upon those cyber attacks. And as we've seen, and it's been stated, Russia has some of the world's best hackers, government funded or government backed, however you want to look at it. Between Russia, Iran, and North Korea, China included, I would say, they're at the top end of cyber warfare when it comes to getting into places where you wouldn't think they'd be able to do it. Baltic air policing, which basically is the entire eastern region of Europe through the Baltic region. That is basically same situation as cyber defense. It's just aircraft, radar, flying patrols ready for intercept, rapid response bombers, things like that. So if something goes full spectrum war, they've got air superiority on tap, ready to go to lock down key areas throughout Europe to then maintain a secure area for ground forces to move in and hold critical passageways, bridges, waterways, things like that. And with, speaking of the rapid response, NATO has an actual quick reaction force. It's the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, the VJTF, and the Spearhead Force. And more or less what they are is they're air, land, naval, satellite, cyber, and intelligence units on a small scale designed to get into and observe or get immediate information about a critical area. If necessary, take direct action to either slow a physical advance, disable any type of potential offensive or defensive weaponry that the Russians may use, while the rest of NATO builds up their full ground force and air force. Because although the troops are there, all the NATO troops are assigned to their home countries until something like this happens. So then they have to determine where it is best to pull troops from, transport them to, and then deploy them from that point going forward. So the VJTF would be effectively, they would hold off and slow down and intercept any type of Russian activity until that larger main battle force can then move in. Now, the possibilities of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine continuing is high. With high confidence, we can all believe that it's not going to end this year with a, hey, sorry about that, let's be friends. The chances of it escalating to something beyond that, that's where, as I said earlier in the video, things get a little tricky, because with the broad brush parameter that NATO set, if a direct or indirect action of any type of nuclear incident occurs, whether or not they can prove that it was Russia, whether or not they can prove that it was deliberate, that's irrelevant. It simply comes down to whatever the activity is, they make the determination on how they're going to respond. And of course, Russia, depending upon what the game plan is, they may play the completely innocent, they may be justifiably innocent, or they may try to hold off a larger NATO force long enough for them to take certain actions to eliminate other NATO countries from intervening. And it's not to say that, this is all some giant master plan, that a man behind the curtain, is doing that whole thing. It's just simply, it leaves too many avenues of opportunity for both legitimate action and illegitimate action to occur. We could have a situation where on the front and up center and up front, you have one country saying, look, we don't want to go down that nuclear road. But you could have someone right behind them going, and detonate in 3. And they have plausible deniability. Actions were taken behind the scenes that the political leadership was unaware of. In other cases, it could be actions are taken from one group to pin the blame on the other group, knowing what activity is going to occur next. But even with that being said, with the focus also on our current situation with China and Taiwan and that area in the Pacific, with the increased tensions building back up again in the Middle East. We're talking from Afghanistan through Iraq, Iran, going into Israel, the entire Middle Eastern region, as well as problems that are on this side of the Atlantic in South, Central, and North America, especially when it comes to several of the governments being near failed states, as well as the increase of paramilitary activity from the drug cartels. It wouldn't take too much for a country that has the capability to launch cyber attacks against multiple nations to hit certain levels of infrastructure, communications, to throw off the ebb and flow, the normal cycle of the civilian aspect of it, getting the citizens of that country stymied, getting them confused, getting them on edge before a physical military action takes place. Effectively, if you could launch a nuke, use a cyber attack, and black out the United States, yes, our nation has plans for that. The government has plans for that, but they don't realistically include the civilians. We're considered non-essential. Specific government agencies, military, those are on the essential. Everyone else, non-essential. But that would slow down and hinder our government's activity overseas. And if it's a case of we move in with Nato and it's a hot war, missiles flying back and forth across multiple regions throughout Europe, lights go out over here, the government's got to make a choice. Continue the fight with NATO there, or turn around and defend the homeland. It's not to say we'd be without protection, but it's a completely different situation and scenario that we would be in, where we are used to being the dominant fighting force wherever we are, because things back home have always been stable. And that's one of those things that you have to consider, that it may not go the way most people think it will initially. It may not be the good old-fashioned 80s where they launch a missile, our satellites pick it up, an alert goes out to the military, jets and bombers start taking off in the air. If you live near a missile base, you see missiles going up and you know that, well, you've got about 10 to 15 minutes to take shelter. It could be simply a case of you hear on the news that several banks were hit by cyberware, by malware, and they have to shut down. Then you find out that a large hospital network system was compromised and that has to be shut down. Then you find out that several hacks have been into mass transit systems in major metropolitan cities and they shut down. And then cyber warfare hits the cellular communication systems and the networks become more erratic and spotty and they shut down. As all these things start shutting down one by one, it might be one day here, 2 days later here, a week later here. But once everything starts shutting down and we're slowed in our natural progression of our daily function, then shutting off the lights, disabling the grid on a large scale, causing cascading failures would be the next step. Once we're blacked out here and we have no reasonable, actionable intelligence that we as civilians can go off of, we have no idea what's going on over there. We may have close contact with people in the government, in the military, that may feed us some information. It may trickle down from the federal to the states to the counties to the local, but that may take a longer period of time depending upon how bad the communication is interrupted. A hot war with missiles and nukes going off and things like that could be taking place for weeks, even months, before we get reliable information about the who, the what, the where, and the when. And if anything does occur over here, you may not know about some actual activity going on 1,500 miles away from your place in the United States because you can't see it, the news isn't reporting it because they don't know about it, and no one within a certain region has any idea of what's going on until it's too late. So with that being said, I would keep a close eye on the things that NATO is making announcements, as well as just watching the news to see how things are going, because it's a back and forth. It's a balance between what is actually happening and what is perceived to be happening. And granted, I don't have my finger on the pulse of all those political workings. I'm watching the same open source information that you guys are. But when you start to see those small little patterns, you can speculate, absolutely, but you can project forward certain steps that either historically governments have taken, or based upon what they've at least stated up front, that if this happens, then this is the response. If this happens, then this is the response. So you can whittle down the options and have a good idea of, when you turn on the news and you hear about cyber attacks happening in multiple countries around the world, or you hear about certain terrorist actions going on in certain countries or hitting certain types of infrastructure, you can start spinning those wheels forward to know that this is where it's going to take us down the road. Anyway, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below, let me know what you think, and I'll catch you in the next one.